As a medical student, I knew the work at the morgue was not for the faint of heart, but I was determined to learn everything I could about the human body. The morgue was a vast, sterile space with white walls, harsh fluorescent lights, and an eerie silence that seemed to linger even when there were people around. I was used to working alone, dissecting and studying the bodies of those who had bequeathed their remains to science. It was a lonely job, but one that was necessary for medical research and education. On this particular day, I was finishing up with one of the bodies when I heard a strange noise. I assumed it was my teacher, who had gone to do some paperwork in a neighboring building. But then the alarm went off, and I knew something was wrong. I rushed to the freezer, thinking that my mentor might have been trapped inside. But when I got there, I ran into my teacher, who was equally confused about the alarm going off. We stood there, looking at each other, and then turned off the alarm. We opened the door to the freezer, and at first, we couldn't see anything out of the ordinary. The bodies were still there, cold and lifeless. But then I noticed something strange. One of the bodies had moved. I couldn't believe my eyes. I walked closer to the body, thinking that perhaps it was just my imagination. But as I got closer, I realized that it was true. The body had moved, and it wasn't just a small movement. The arms had shifted, and the head had turned slightly to the side. I was frozen with fear. My teacher noticed my reaction and asked what was wrong. I pointed to the body, and we both stood there in disbelief. We knew that there was no way the motion sensors could have been triggered. The body was cold, and there was no one else in the room with us. And yet, the body had moved. We tried to rationalize what we had seen, but it was impossible. We knew that something strange was happening in the morgue, and it was something that we couldn't explain. From that day on, I was always uneasy when I worked at the morgue. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were not alone in the room, and that the bodies we were studying were not as lifeless as they appeared. Eventually, I left the morgue and pursued a different career in medicine. But I will never forget the feeling of fear and uncertainty that I experienced that day, and the strange movement of a body that defied explanation. As a recent graduate looking for job experience, I was thrilled to be hired as a night worker in a rehabilitation center for teenagers. The facility was located in a remote area, surrounded by woods and far away from any city or town. I was warned that the job might be challenging, especially as a newcomer, but I was excited to make a difference in the lives of the teens who were recovering from substance abuse, trauma, and mental health issues. About a week after I started working at the center, one of my colleagues mentioned Amanda's story. I had never heard of her before, but I soon realized that her memories still haunted the place. According to my colleagues, Amanda was a patient at the center over a decade ago, and she had tragically committed suicide by hanging herself in the shower. Ever since then, her ghost had been seen and heard by various people who worked there, mostly at night. I listened to their stories, but I was sure that they were just trying to scare me, the newcomer. At first, I tried not to pay too much attention to the stories. I was focused on my job, checking on the teens, making sure that they were following the rules, and staying safe. However, as the weeks went by, I started to feel a strange energy in the center, especially at night. Sometimes I heard strange noises, whispers, or footsteps that seemed to come from nowhere. I also noticed that some of the teens were more agitated than usual, as if they were picking up on something that I couldn't see or understand. Then one night I did my rounds alone. My partner had gone for a smoke break, and I was left to check on the kids. As I was walking down the hallway, I saw a girl sitting in the corner. She looked young, about 16 or 17 years old, and her arms were wrapped around her knees. She was staring at the wall, but when I approached her, she looked up at me. I could see tears in her eyes, and she looked very sad. "Hey there," I said gently. "Are you okay? What's your name?" The girl didn't answer. She just looked at me, and I felt a chill run down my spine. I heard some noise behind me, and I turned around to see what it was. When I looked back at the girl, she was no longer there. The corner was empty, and the hallway was silent. My partner returned from his break, and I told him what I had seen. He looked at me with a mixture of surprise and concern. "Well, yes," he said slowly. "That was Amanda." I was shocked. I had never seen a ghost before, and I didn't know how to react. I wanted to believe that it was just my imagination, but the more I thought about it, the more convinced I became that I had seen Amanda's ghost. It explained the strange noises, the whispers, and the footsteps that I had heard before. It also explained why some of the teens were so agitated at night. They could feel Amanda's presence too. As the days went by, I started to feel more and more uneasy. I tried to avoid the hallway where I had seen Amanda, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was watching me, even when I was in another part of the center. I'd also noticed that some of the teens were acting out more, as if they were under some kind of influence or pressure. I tried to talk to them, to understand what was going on, but they wouldn't say anything. They just looked at me with fear or suspicion. As an employee of a former psychiatric hospital, the dark history of the building was no secret to me. The building, originally constructed by monks, was converted into a clinic for SS members during the Second World War. The brick corridors and ugly sculptures of long-dead monks were just some of many eerie elements that filled the hospital. My typical routine involved working late into the night, and one winter night was no different. As I was walking to the exit, I heard the sound of footsteps, many running feet in the distance. I stopped in my tracks, trying to discern where the sound was coming from, but then it was silent once more. I continued down the stairs, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling that had crept over me. As I made my way to the exit, I noticed a flicker of red lights at the other end of the corridor. My heart raced as I hesitantly approached the strange occurrence, but as quickly as the lights had appeared, they vanished. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched and pressed on towards the exit, but the sound of running feet filled the air again. This time, I knew I had to investigate the source. As I cautiously rounded the corner, a crowd of children jumped out at me, shouting and screaming. I was so startled that I almost had a heart attack. The children had apparently snuck into the building to play laser tag, taking the keys from one of their parents. They believed there was no one in the building and never expected to be confronted by an employee in the middle of the night. I let out a sigh of relief, grateful that the source of the strange noises had finally been revealed. However, as I made my way back through the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. It was as if the walls themselves were watching me, silently waiting for me to let down my guard. A few weeks passed without incident, but then strange occurrences began to happen with increasing frequency. The sound of footsteps and whispers echoed through the hallways, even when I knew I was alone in the building. Doors would creak open and shut on their own, and strange shadows moved across the walls. I began to dread my late-night shifts, fearing what might be waiting for me in the dark corners of the hospital. One night, as I made my rounds, I stumbled across a room that I had never seen before. It was filled with strange, archaic medical equipment and research notes from the clinic's SS past. As I looked through the notes, I realized with horror that the children who had played laser tag in the hospital were not the only ones to have snuck in after hours. There were numerous reports of strange apparitions and unexplainable occurrences that had been happening for years, and no one had been able to identify the source. I tried to leave the room, but the door refused to budge. It was as if something was holding it shut from the other side. As I frantically tried to escape, the whispers and footsteps grew louder and more frenzied. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the door gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway. The building seemed to be alive, its every corner filled with malevolent spirits that were just waiting for the right moment to strike. I quit my job at the psychiatric hospital the next day, never to return again. Even now, years later, I still can't shake the feeling that something is lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to let my guard down once more. As a janitor at an elementary school, John had gotten used to the routine of cleaning the classrooms and hallways. He would work alone, with only the sound of his own footsteps echoing through the silent halls at night. However, one night, something strange happened that would change his perspective on the job forever. It was just another late-night shift, and John was sitting in the dark office, headphones on, watching a YouTube video during a break. Suddenly, he heard a child's voice. It was loud and clear, and it demanded that John wipe down the bench. John quickly took off his headphones and looked around the empty office, but there was no one there. Confused and a little bit frightened, he replayed the video. but there was no voice. The silence in the school felt suffocating. John felt like he was being watched, like there was someone else there with him. He tried to shake the feeling off and continued cleaning the classrooms, but he couldn't get the voice out of his head. Then, he remembered the memorial bench that was dedicated to a boy who had died in a car accident. John went outside to the bench and made sure that it was clean. As he was wiping it down, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up, and he had an eerie feeling that something was wrong. He quickly finished his task and went back inside. The rest of the night was uneventful, but John couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. He decided to look up the story of the boy who the bench was dedicated to, and he found out that the boy's name was Jack. He had been hit by a car on his way home from school a year ago, and the school had dedicated the bench to him. John felt a sudden chill go down his spine. He realized that the voice he heard earlier might have been the ghost of the boy asking him to clean his bench. From that moment on, John made sure that the bench was always clean, and he never ignored any requests that he heard in the school. The school became a very different place for John after that. He couldn't shake the feeling that Jack's ghost was following him, and he always felt like he was being watched. But he never told anyone about his experiences, not even Jack's family. He just made sure that the bench was always clean, and he continued to work his job as a janitor. But every night, when he walked out of the school, he couldn't help but feel like he was leaving something behind. Something that would never leave him alone. It was a typical Friday night at the nightclub. The music was blasting, the dance floor was packed, and the drinks were flowing. But for the cloakroom attendant, Sasha, it was a slow night. The club wasn't particularly busy, and she found herself with nothing to do. To pass the time, Sasha stared out the window at the multi-story parking lot across the street. It was an odd-looking structure with a rusty metal exterior and flickering neon lights on the top level. As she gazed at it, something caught her eye. A figure was standing on the edge of the top level, silhouetted against the dark night sky. Sasha squinted, trying to get a better look. Suddenly, the figure jumped. Sasha gasped and ran outside to see what had happened. But when she got to the parking lot, there was no body to be found. She looked around frantically, but there was no one else there. It was as if the person had vanished into thin air. Sasha was terrified, but she tried to brush it off as her imagination. Maybe she had just been seeing things. But then it happened again. Every week, Sasha would see the figure on the roof jumping to their death. And every week, there was no body to be found. It was as if the person had simply disappeared into thin air. Sasha tried to get her colleagues to believe her, but they all thought she was crazy. They had never seen or heard anything like it. She even checked the security camera footage, but there was no sign of anyone falling from the roof. Desperate for answers, Sasha started researching the history of the parking lot. She went to the local library and dug through old newspapers and records, but she couldn't find any evidence of people dying in or around the parking lot. Sasha felt like she was losing her mind. She couldn't explain what she was seeing, but it was so vivid and real. She even started to recognize the figure. It was always the same person, wearing the same clothes. Eventually, Sasha reached a breaking point. She couldn't take the constant terror anymore. She quit her job at the nightclub and moved away, hoping to leave the haunting figure behind. But even in her new home, Sasha couldn't shake the feeling of unease. Every time she saw a tall building or multi-story car park, she would think of the figure jumping. She never found out the truth behind the haunting, and it still lingers in her mind to this day.